Well, this is surely one of those rare occasions when a host can legitimately say that our guest, of course, requires no introduction. But for the benefit of those here who may not be members of the GI generation or of the boomer generation, permit me at least to make a brief introduction. David Rockefeller was born in 1915 in New York City, the youngest of 6 children, 1 daughter and 5 sons of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. Often on roller skates, shadowed by a chauffeured limousine, he attended the Lincoln School of Columbia University's Teachers College for 12 years. His teachers there thought him a slow learner, a condition diagnosed later in life as dyslexia, a disability that also afflicted 3 of his siblings. During these youthful years, he also acquired an extensive collection of beetles by erecting at night a sheet illuminated with a light on the porch of his family estate in Westchester County. He graduated from Harvard College in 1936 with a degree in English history and literature. After postgraduate study at Harvard and the London School of Economics, he earned his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in 1940. His doctoral thesis, Unused Business Resources and Economic Waste, was published by the University of Chicago Press. In 1940, shortly after receiving his PhD, he went to work at $1 a year as the secretary to New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. And there he immediately put the theory of his doctoral thesis to work and won the admiration of his honor by finding tenants for the undeveloped commercial space at the city's new airport that had been named for the mayor. That summer, he married Peggy McGrath, and that was a bond that would last for 56 years until her death in 1996. They would have 4 daughters, 2 sons, and 10 grandchildren. In March of 1942, Mr. Rockefeller enlisted in the United States Army as a private and began basic training at Fort Jay on Governor's Island, where he found that playing baseball was far more stressful than all of the close order drills. A year later, he entered engineer OCS school, followed by further training at the Military Intelligence School at Fort Ritchie, Maryland. For the remainder of the Second World War, he served in both North Africa and France, including 8 months as an assistant military attaché in Paris, and he was awarded by the French government the Legion of Honor before his discharge as a captain in 1945. In 1946, he joined the Chase Bank, soon to be known as the Chase Manhattan Bank, as a lowly assistant manager in the foreign department at the munificent salary of $3,500 a year. He commuted to work each morning on the Lexington Avenue subway. And during the next 35 years, 11 of them as chairman and CEO, he transformed the Chase Bank from a somewhat, if you'll excuse the expression, dowdy, conservative domestic institution into an international financial powerhouse, and simultaneously he emerged as one of the world's most influential and often controversial banking leaders. 3 times he would decline a presidential invitation to become Secretary of the Treasury, and once he would decline the post as the head of the Federal Reserve Board. From 1950 to 1975 as chairman of Rockefeller University, and later as the head of its executive committee, he presided over the transformation of that institution into perhaps the premier center of cell biology in this country and the world. During most of the 1980s, he served as chairman of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a major grant-making organization that he and his brothers first created in 1940. Continuing a tradition begun by his mother, Mr. Rockefeller has played a significant role in the long and glorious history of New York's Museum of Modern Art, where he has served as a trustee since 1948. For 15 years, beginning in 1970, he was also the chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations. He is the past president of Harvard College's Board of Overseers and a life trustee of the University of Chicago, founded by his grandfather. He has left his imprint on urban redevelopment projects from Lower Manhattan to San Francisco's Embarcadero and L'Enfant Plaza in our nation's capital. Renoir's Gabriel at the Mirror once hung in his living room. 3 of Monet's water lilies graced his stairwell at Hudson Pines. He has been described as one of America's greatest business leaders and philanthropists. He's also been described as the chairman of the board of America's ruling class. He has been pilloried regularly by the left and by the right for dancing with dictators and for conspiring to enslave the nation to the machinations of the Trilateral Commission. Random House has recently published his memoirs, a volume written with much clarity and a great deal of candor about himself and his family. Will you please join with me in welcoming David Rockefeller?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
Well, you begin your memoirs by describing the return of your grandfather's casket to Tarrytown, New York, following his death in 1937 at the age of 97. You were then, I believe, 22 years old. Your grandfather, of course, was the principal organizer of the Standard Oil Company. He had been often condemned by the muckrakers as a predatory monopolist. And the Supreme Court, in fact, dissolved his original company in 1911. Can you tell us a little bit about your memories of this man and of the relationship he had to your father and also to your other brothers?
I'd be happy to. As you say, I was just 21 or 2 when he died, but that meant that I actually knew him quite well during my youth. And he had a house not far from ours in Tarrytown, New York. I used to go up and have breakfast with him quite often and just walk up the hill. And he was very informal, very warm. He loved having his grandchildren come to see him. And he would tell funny little stories that he remembered and sometimes sing some kind of song. The image that he created with me was very distant from the one that was written about him as a terrible predator and someone who'd done all kinds of things that were bad for the country. I think that that was what he really was like. And I have to say that my own feeling, based on reading about him as well, is that the books that were written that were so critical of him missed the point that at a time when the oil industry was just beginning, and there were a lot of small producers of oil, he was able to pull the industry together and admittedly created a monopoly, but the fact was that it made oil prices go down and made an industry great, which subsequently enabled the country to expand. So I have great admiration for him for what he did, as well as the fact that he was a loving and wonderful grandfather. Quite a different story than Ida Tarbell talked.
Your brother Lawrence has become, of course, very well known for his efforts on behalf of conservation. But it was perhaps your own father, John Jr., who began that particular tradition at places like Dyerville Flats in California, the Grand Tetons, and Mesa Verde. Can you tell us something about your father's conservation endeavors in that regard, and what inspired these undertakings, for example, in California, the Grand Tetons, and Mesa Verde?
Yes, I was actually had the good fortune to be with him on a number of the instances when he got interested in those things. But let me just say a word first about him, because of course he was Father's only son. He had 4 sisters, but he was the only son, and I think grew up feeling rather insecure as to what he would do with his life. And in fact, he tried for a couple of years to go into the Standard Oil Company, didn't enjoy it, and decided to devote his life to philanthropy. And I must say that I think he, along with grandfather, who had created both the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which now, of course, is the Rockefeller University. Father, first of all, felt that his job in life was to serve his father. He was a very great admirer of my grandfather. But as life evolved, he did an enormous number of things on his own. And his technique, which you've really alluded to, was an interesting one. He, of course, worked with the foundation and the institute, and was president of both of them for many years. But when he would take trips, often with his children, he would see things that he thought needed to be done and were not being done. So, for example, on one trip we went to the Yellowstone Park, and Horace Albright, who later became head of the National Park System, was then the superintendent of the Yellowstone, and he urged Father to go with the children, myself included, down to Jackson's Hole. And it was on that trip that Father saw that the Jackson's Hole, which is the big valley, if any of you've been there, which is at the foot of these magnificent Grand Teton mountains, was beginning to be destroyed by all kinds of road stands, lots of billboards, and that kind of thing, so that the joy of seeing these beautiful mountains was being ruined. And so Father, perhaps, in fact, I think definitely with the cooperation of Horace Albright, started to buy up the land. Well, this created all kinds of opposition because the land was being used by sheep farmers, and they didn't want their land to be removed from their use. So that he was very much criticized, but he spent 20 years and finally acquired most of the land, buying it in small bits, and then gave it to the government. But I don't think he's ever given anything for which, during the process of putting it together, he was more criticized for. Now I think that there would be very few people who go there that wouldn't feel that this was a very good thing for him to have done. Another example is in connection with Colonial Williamsburg. I hope some of you have had a chance to go there, but he took the same group of his children, including me, and in point of fact, it was the same year. It was the spring of the year that we went out to the Yellowstone, and we met with the head of the Bruton Parish Church, who showed us around. That was the one building that was still in good shape, and we could see it. But then he showed Father another building, that the George Wythe House, which was falling to pieces, and he said to Father, could you perhaps help to restore this house, because it has great importance historically, and it's a very beautiful house. Father did so, and then in the process came to realize there were a lot of other houses that were not doing very well, and some that had been destroyed and weren't there at all. And he discovered that there were records for the entire city of Williamsburg, which of course had been the capital of Virginia before the country became independent, and therefore it was possible to restore it. So Father bought up all this land over a period of time, again finding opposition in a number of instances, but today the whole town is there, and I think is really a wonderful monument to our colonial history, because it was clearly one of the most beautiful towns in the country, as well as historically important.
In your memoirs, you speak of both of your parents, and I gather the impression of much greater closeness to your mother than to your father. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how each of them influenced you. Your mother, I know, was a great patroness of the avant-garde, and that her tastes in art were very, very different from your father's. But both of them obviously shaped you, but in very different ways. Could you talk about how they did influence you?
I'd be glad to. Father, of course, had been brought up by his parents, but his mother particularly was a very devout Baptist, and her whole interest was in helping Baptist churches around the country. And of course, in the early days, she wasn't able to, but as grandfather made his fortune, she did a great deal. And of course, Laura Spelman College was named for her. But she didn't believe that her son should do very much in the way of socializing with other people. And in fact, on Sundays, he could read the Bible and go to church and take a walk, but not even do his studies. So that was a kind of background that, had it been carried on to all of us, I think would have been pretty difficult in the modern day. My mother was the daughter of Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, who had been in the United States Senate for 33 years. He was brought up in much more, in a much more urbane way, as was my mother, so that they enjoyed going out to parties and doing things. And the wonderful thing is that a mother who met my father when he was at Brown, where he went to college, and they became devoted and were, as you've mentioned, happily married for 56 years. But the two of them each contributed something very important, I think, in terms of their children, because I think that on the one hand, Father introduced an element of responsive feeling that we should have responsibility. He certainly introduced our religious life through going to Sunday school and things of that kind, much more than Mother probably would have. She took a lighter view of the world and was interested in a great broad variety of things, all the arts being an important aspect. And whereas Father didn't really approve of her taste in the arts, the house that we lived in, which was 9 stories high, he felt that if she had one floor on which she put the pictures that she liked, she wouldn't have to go there. And that worked out very well. But since the children were allowed to go there, and we're happy to, that's really where I got to see contemporary art, because Mother was very interested in it. She liked all kinds of art, and you're right, you said there was closer to Mother, and in a way that's true. She was easier to be close to, and she was very devoted to her children, as was Father. It was harder for Father to be close. It wasn't easy for him to just sort of relax and do things. On the other hand, on these trips that we took together, he was wonderful in teaching us. He also would teach us how to pack our bags, which has been, since I've done a great deal of traveling, that's been a very useful thing to know how to do, but not just dump the clothes into the bag, but put them piece by piece carefully in so you can get much more in. And he would follow us and make sure that we packed our bags on the trip that way. He also taught us to spend our money carefully, and so we were given rather modest amounts of income as children. I mean, a few dollars a week, and I mean, maybe 3 or 4, not many dollars. But we had to give 10% of that away, and we had to make an account of what we spent in an account book. And then at the end of each week, he would look at that with us, and if the two didn't add up, we had to put in an item unaccounted for. Well, all of this, in a way, sounds, in today's world, almost a little silly, but the fact is that I think it left a very important imprint on all of us. We never had the feeling as children that anything we wanted we could be given. If we couldn't earn it, maybe over time he would give it to us. But I think that this was very important. And the other thing that I didn't say that I should, if any of us were in trouble and were worried about something, we could go to Father and he would be the most tender and wonderful, loving Father. In other words, I think his shyness didn't enable him to have as much fun with all of us, but when we were in need, he was a wonderful father.
You write in your book that it was your mother that encouraged you, your mother who encouraged you in 1942 to enlist in the Army. How did she put that? Well,
this is also shows you what a remarkable woman she was, because I can't imagine a more devoted mother. And in fact, between the wars, she'd become an active pacifist and really felt that any war was bad no matter what. But then when Hitler came to power and started to do the terrible things in Germany that he was, and when the war in Europe began, Mother came to realize that the world had to stop him. And she felt very strongly early on, long before many people, others in this country felt, that we should get into the war. In other words, she completely changed her attitude on the war. And I think, personally, she was absolutely right to do it, but it shows that what a remarkable person, because on the one hand, incidentally, there were 5 sons and 1 daughter. That was the only mistake in your very excellent and accurate listing of my background. But she, with 5 sons, obviously she didn't want to see them go to war and die. But she felt so strongly that she felt that we ought to go in. And so while I had at the time, I was married and had 2 children, and under the draft law, I was not obligated to do so, she said, you know, I really think that you should set a good example and that you should enlist now, which I did. And I'm sure she was absolutely right.
You and your brothers in 1948 bought Rockefeller Center from your father. And according to your book, your share of the purchase was 20%, which amounted to about $442,000, I believe is what you say in the book.
It's not a bad buy.
Not a bad buy. And then when you sold Rockefeller Center to the Japanese in 1989, which also stirred a great deal of controversy, of course, apparently they paid into your trust fund $171.3 million. Is that the largest return you've ever garnered on an investment?
It was pretty good.
You can't think of a larger one.
No, but I think it should be pointed out that when we bought it, Father had owned it for over 20 years and had virtually no return, and had borrowed a substantial amount of money, so that this was the appraised value of this center at that time, X the debt, because there was very heavy debt on it also. So that although I don't think there's any doubt even then that it was a wonderful opportunity, and we so considered it, at the time it was a legitimate price because of the heavy debt and the fact that it had never had any kind of return. In fact, Father had had it for nearly 50 years, and I think had almost no return on the center. That's the other side of the story. Then, of course, then we sold it to the Japanese because they were very interested at that moment in buying real estate and land in New York, in fact, all around the country, and a lot of it out here in California, as you know, golf courses. The group that wanted to buy it was an extremely responsible group. We felt they were in real estate very heavily in Japan. We felt that they would operated well, and that there was no reason why they shouldn't have bought it. And I must say, I still feel that. I have certainly come to believe that the world has to be much more international than it has been, that both investments and other activities, education and everything else, needs to be multinational. And we felt that to have a very responsible Japanese company own it would not in any way be a bad thing for the country or for us. And in point of fact, they did run it very well. But the other side of that story is that later on, the Japanese got into great trouble, and they had to sell it, and we bought it back. And now it belongs to another company. But the history of the center was a fascinating one, and I think the end result is it today is probably the best example in New York of intelligent use of real estate, and because there's open space with big buildings, something that had never been done in New York before. So I think the story is a good one, and I still think that it's sad for the Japanese that they did what they did. I mean, in fact, this is another aspect of the story. I felt that it was very foolish for them to sell it when they did. And I went over to Japan to talk to the people who owned it. Just outside the building where I was to see them, I fell and broke my leg. And it took half an hour before I could get a wheelchair to take me. The reason for that was that the first person who came up to help found out my name, and I was much too important for them to be able to help, so they went back to get someone else. And the second person had the same reaction, so it took 3 people before I could get help or a wheelchair. But then I went upstairs and saw these people, the owners, the people who, yes, the owners, and told them that I thought they'd make a great mistake in selling it, but they sold it anyway. So at least I felt that I'd done my bit under rather dire circumstances, and if they didn't take my advice, I think it was their responsibility.
Once you assumed leadership of the Chase Manhattan Bank in the late 1960s, you pursued a very aggressive campaign of globalization, which to some extent had been blocked by your predecessor there, Mr. Champion, and the other members of the old guard at the Chase Bank. Now, looking back on that period after you assumed that leadership role, what do you regard as your greatest achievement in terms of the transformation, and what also was your greatest disappointment?
Well, I think that there were two things that I soon felt once I came with the bank, even when I was in a very junior position and didn't have responsibility. One was that in those days, bankers felt that the only thing that was important in a bank is to lend money and lend it well and get it back. But the management of the bank was something they really paid no attention to, so that here was this great bank. It wasn't as big then as it is now, but it didn't have a budget, and it didn't have any management organization. And it just seemed to me that didn't make sense, and finally I persuaded the management before I became president that at least they should have a budget and an organization chart. So I think bringing, and then very soon thereafter we brought in professional people who were involved in management, and I think today it's a very well managed bank. The other thing that I felt was that a number of people in the old guard, and you mentioned George Champion, who was an admirable banker in the sense that he was very respected. He knew everybody in the business world across the country, and he was much better at making loans than I was. But it was his conviction that the Chase should be the greatest national bank for American business. I felt that since American business, in response to the globalization of the world that was already taking place and the move of businesses in our country abroad in order to take care of the companies that they were dealing with overseas, and that was becoming a major part of their business, I felt that we couldn't do a good job in taking care of our even American customers unless we had branches overseas. So little by little, over a period of about 30 years, we opened branches and offices in about 50 countries around the world, and were represented in other ways in many more than that. And of course, this was once something that was of great interest to me, and therefore I quite frequently would go over to the countries which I thought we should be in and meet with the leaders of the country as well as the business leaders. And this of course, is essentially the way that I happen to know as many people as I do around the world. And I feel that was certainly one of the best things I did for the bank. I think in terms of what was my greatest disappointment, I just felt that most of these things should have been sooner and better, and I was constantly frustrated by feeling that we just weren't making the progress that I thought we should. But there were moments when we had serious problems, and there was a time when the media was quite critical of my management of the bank. In fact, one of the papers had a headline on the front page of the paper, "David, fire yourself." Well, I have to say, that was not a very pleasant thing to read.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that episode, because in the mid-1970s, apparently, following the collapse of the Chase Manhattan Mortgage and Realty Trust and a major accounting scandal apparently in your bond department, some of the members of the board really wanted your head. At least that's what you suggest in your book. How did you manage to survive that crisis? Could they really have fired David Rockefeller?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that they could have and would have had we not done something about it. But you're quite right that it was a scandal. On the other hand, the nature of the scandal, I think, is quite different than what's been going on today. What I learned, I was in Washington with my wife at a dinner entertaining some foreign guests at the international, I guess it was the IMF meetings there, and learned that it had been discovered that we had inaccurately reported the earnings and figures in the bond department. So I flew back, left the dinner and flew back, and got our various people together so that by the next morning we could find out. The fact was that the head of the bond department, who was a very good bond person, was so regarded generally on the street, had thought that the value of the bonds that we had was going to go up, and instead they went down. And he was so convinced that they were going to go back up that he falsified the figures. So it was one individual in one specific example. This was not something general in the bank. Needless to say, he didn't stay very long, and we made some important restructuring in the bond department. But I think you'll agree, you can say it's a major scandal, and in a sense it was, but it was one particular episode, not a question of a lot of people making a lot of money at the expense of the shareholders, and the minute that we found out about it, we were able to correct it.
But there were members of the board when they put together the bond incident along with apparently the real estate collapse,
That's true.
who were very unhappy about your leadership of the bank. Is that not the case?
I think that that's true, and one of our directors at one point said to me that he thought that unless some of these problems which had turned up were not corrected within a year, that he thought that they would fire me. And I think probably he was right. Fortunately, we corrected the problems. And so that in the 3 years before I retired, we set a rather ambitious program for the bank for the next 3 years, and happily, the year that I retired, we had achieved what we had set out to achieve. So that was the happy note, and it's always nice to have the happy note at the end of the episode.
One of the other controversial events in your life, of course, concerns the Shah of Iran and the revolution that occurred in Iran. In your memoirs, you argue the point of view that had President Carter and his advisors been a trifle more decisive about admitting the Shah very early from his exile, that this might have alleviated the later crisis that occurred, and that it was that indecisiveness that may have led to the taking of the hostages in Tehran, and that really your influence and that of, say, Mr. Kissinger's has been vastly overrated by those who have looked at that particular crisis. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Essentially, yes, but let me give you a little more of the background on it. President Carter went to visit the Shah on a trip and had dinner with him. This was on New Year's, of the year that he was subsequently removed. And at that dinner, he broadcast around the world a speech in which he said, the United States has never had a greater friend than the Shah of Iran, and that the two countries were very close together, and it was just a very, very strong and positive speech. I found having said that, and presumably meant it when he said it, to when the Shah, for reasons that were not directly related to that incident or anything that was related to what Carter knew at the time, was removed, I felt that, and so did Henry Kissinger, who was, had also known him and worked with me on this, we worked together, we felt that at the very least he should be invited to find refuge in the United States, or if we didn't do that, that at least the United States should help him because he had been a good friend. And more than that, and this is an aside, the Shah, during his period of office, had enormously expanded the educational system in Iran and the health system, and the country was far better off, and the people in the country were far better off than when he came. So that although there's no question that he did have secret police that probably tortured people and did a lot of things that were bad, it also was true that his successor governments, they may have tortured different people, but they tortured just as many, and in my judgment, were just as bad. So I felt that even though perhaps it was justified that he leave office, and this of course was due to a whole series of other things, that the United States owed him help. And we not only didn't allow him in the country, but the government didn't do anything to help him find another spot. So that literally, Henry Kissinger and I and 2 or 3 other people helped him find a place first in the Bahamas and then in Mexico, and then finally persuaded President Carter to let him in when it turned out that he had cancer and needed help from the point of view of his health, so that he did finally come. But it seemed to me that this was a succession of events that did not speak well for our country.
As with all siblings, and you write very candidly about this, you and your brothers had occasional differences, and sometimes they were quite sharp. But of your brothers, you appear to have had the most complex and contentious relationship with your brother Nelson, who was the titular head of your siblings. Why was that the case? What was it about your relationship with Nelson Rockefeller that made it so contentious and so complicated?
Well, I think the part that made it most difficult in a way was that I had always enormously admired him as a child. I felt that he was very much at ease with everyone, that he knew exactly where he wanted to go and had taken intelligent steps to get there. I felt that he had done a good job as governor. But he did a number of things which I didn't agree with. He was divorced from his first wife, who I had known very well and been on a trip to Egypt with my parents, and I felt that for him to do that and remarry very quickly was regrettable, and that and a number of other things of that sort made my relationship with him less close than it had been. And even while he was governor, there were a few things where we were at odds. On the other hand, at no time did we not have a close working relationship. And I respected him enormously, and I still think that had he been elected president, he would have done a very good job. So that it was a mix. It was sad in that a close relationship had become confused and less close, but it never was one where I ceased to feel that he was a very able person and did a wonderful job as governor.
You also write very candidly about the strained relationships among or with your children and also with Nelson's children during the 1960s and 70s, a very turbulent time in which oftentimes children tended to develop political ideas very different from their parents. You experienced that very directly with your own children, and apparently Nelson was extremely angry about how many of the children had
yes, I think he was more angry with them, perhaps, than I was, in that they were critical of him during his period as governor. But bear in mind that this was the period of the war in Vietnam, when American youth, by and large, was strongly opposed to our going in. I felt that although there were many aspects of it that were very undesirable and that we didn't handle it well, that the threat of the Soviet Union on the one hand and of the new emerging communist China on the other, which was really supporting the Vietnamese and were threatening, I felt, and of course this was what the government felt at the time, that they were going to, if they had taken Vietnam, they would have gone right on down and probably taken Australia, and that the world would have become a communist world, which I felt was very much against the best interests of our country. So that I had, while I was not happy about many things that were going on in relation to the war, I had a different point of view than my children. And so during the period of the 60s and early 70s, we had strong arguments and were much less close than we had been before. But even during that period, the children were always welcome to come home and did come home frequently. So it wasn't as though we broke relations, they were strained relations. And then I think the thing that to both my wife and myself was very touching was that in 1980, a few years later, the children together came to us and said that they would like to take the two of us for a week with them at their expense anywhere in the world we wanted to go. They didn't say why they were doing it, but they did, and a more touching and wonderful thing for parents to have had done, I can't imagine. We did. We went out to Jackson Hole, spent a week with them. Their reasons for doing it were never discussed, but we had an absolutely wonderful time, and that was the beginning of a new era where, even though we may have little differences today, they have been very close. So again, it was a happy ending.
Let me turn to a more contemporary topic. Recently, an economist at Princeton, quite distinguished, Paul Krugman, who I think won the John Bates Clark Medal and also served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Professor Krugman argued in a recent New York Times piece that the distribution of income in this country is now probably as skewed as at any time since the late 1920s, before the stock market crash. And he cited some figures, for example, that the 13,000 richest families have almost as much income as the 20 million poorest households, and that the average compensation of CEOs is about 1,000 times the pay of ordinary workers. Now, as an economist and also as a citizen, do those statistics concern you in terms of the distribution of income and in terms of the enormous variation now in this country?
They do. I think that it's excessive. I would say, though, that I read the report that you're speaking of. Just in the last 3 or 4 days, the New York Times had a different article saying that, in point of fact, the poor have improved their lot, if anything, more than the wealthy during this period, which I don't know if you saw that.
Didn't see that.
It's interesting, and it would be interesting to know. But aside from the point, I think that that isn't a healthy situation, and I think that it would be desirable to see it change. But my own feeling is that the important thing is to find ways of improving, lessening the number of poor in our country, rather than simply taking all of the money from the rich and turning it over to the poor. I don't believe that's the way to solve the problem. I think there are lots of things that need to be done, and I think that that situation is not as good as is undesirable. But I do think you should look up the more recent.
I'll take a look at that
report, because I was pleased to see it. I'd read the one you said, and the other one said that the
well,
figures
if you were, say,
different.
advising the president today with respect to economic policy, since the stock market seems to be treading water, the economy seems to really not have made a major turnaround, what sort of advice would you give him about, say, a mixture of monetary and fiscal policy? Is there any sort of formula that you would recommend to sort of get us out of this present stalemate, if you want to call it that?
I'm sure that it is a mixture of monetary and fiscal policy that has to be used, and by and large, it seems to me that we've had people both in the Federal Reserve and in the Treasury who have understood these problems quite well. And by and large, I think they have been taking appropriate measures. What I'm sure of is that in order to change the basic situation that you referred to, we need to find ways of finding more employment, of finding ways of raising the income status of the poor, not just of lopping off what the rich have. That doesn't mean that appropriate tax policy isn't useful, and that probably, and that also tax policy that means that the percentage payments for the wealthy are substantially higher than for the poor. Obviously, that's a desirable thing. But I think that to do what we did right after the war, which was to put the top tax rates up to something like 90%, was counterproductive, because what it meant was that the incentives for people with lesser amounts to do well and make money were very much reduced. I think that the American system of giving opportunities for the people with very little, if they are successful, to make a large amount of money, has been one of the reasons we've done so well. My own grandfather was a very poor, was raised in a very poor family. And I think that the incentives that we have are very important. And therefore, I think dealing with the problem of bad distribution that taxes is not the only way to do it.
With apologies to James Lipton at the Actors Studio, let me ask you a few little short, quick questions. Who was the greatest mayor of New York City in your lifetime?
Until maybe a year or two ago, I think I would have said Fiorello LaGuardia without any question. I do think that the way that Mayor Giuliani handled the tragedy of the Trade Center was so skillful and so good that it has to lift his position to a very high one. The strange thing is that before that happened, I had worked with him a certain amount and seen him a certain amount. I thought he was doing an adequate and good job, but I don't believe anybody recognized the qualities that he showed in that terrible episode, so that his stock has to go way up. Whether it goes ahead of Fiorello LaGuardia, I think history will tell.
Who was the worst mayor?
Well, there were a number in that category. And I don't know that I want to mention all their names. I think they've been improving. I have great hopes for the present mayor. I think that he may turn out to be a very good one.
What's your favorite painting?
I don't think I have a favorite painting. I have a number of favorite artists whose paintings I love. Monet is certainly one, but I think I would feel rather unhappy if I had to have one painting and forget about the rest. I think it's nice to be able to enjoy lots of them and change one's mind. I don't think you need to necessarily have one that remains your favorite.
Well, we are certainly grateful for you taking this time to be with us this evening, and we want to thank the center here for hosting it. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for your excellent job. Appreciate it. Thank you.